The squad cars rolled up just after dawn on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, their red and blue lights cutting through the soft fog that still clung to the manicured lawns of the quiet subdivision outside Springfield, Missouri. Neighbors in bathrobes stepped onto their porches, coffee mugs in hand, watching as 6 officers emerged and walked with deliberate purpose toward the neat brick ranch at the end of Maple Court. The house had been there since the early 70s, its shutters freshly painted, flower beds already showing the first signs of spring tulips pushing through the mulch. It was the kind of house where kids sold lemonade in summer and Christmas lights went up the day after Thanksgiving. The kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. But this morning, something was about to shatter that illusion completely. When the front door opened and the officers went inside, the neighbors waited, confused and curious. 10 minutes later, they emerged with someone in handcuffs. An elderly figure, gray-haired and stooped, being guided into the back of a patrol car with a hand on their head. The watching neighbors couldn't believe what they were seeing. And when they found out why the arrest was happening, when they learned it was connected to a murder from 45 years ago, a crime that had haunted their community since 1979, their disbelief would turn to something much darker. How could someone live among them all this time, smiling and waving, attending church potlucks and neighborhood barbecues, while carrying the secret of what they'd done? Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. The arrest that shocked Springfield in March 2024 was the culmination of a 45-year journey through grief, frustration, and finally, technological breakthrough. The case had been declared cold decades ago, its evidence boxes gathering dust in a basement storage room at the Greene County Sheriff's Office, visited occasionally by detectives who'd stare at the faded photographs and wonder if justice would ever come. But advances in forensic genealogy, the same science that had caught the Golden State Killer and solved dozens of other cold cases, had finally given investigators the tool they needed. A DNA profile that had sat useless in a database for years suddenly became a roadmap leading directly to a killer who'd thought they'd gotten away with murder. And that roadmap led to the last place anyone expected. The story really begins in the summer of 1979 when Jimmy Carter was president. Gas lines stretched around city blocks, and a song called My Sharona dominated radio airwaves across America. In the small town of Willard, Missouri, just outside Springfield, life moved at the gentle pace of all rural communities. Everyone knew. Everyone. Doors stayed unlocked. Children rode bikes until the streetlights came on, and the biggest excitement was Friday night football games at the high school. It was the kind of place where tragedy wasn't supposed to happen, where evil was something you read about in newspapers from bigger cities, not something that touched your own backyard. But evil doesn't care about zip codes or the innocence of small-town life. And in August of 1979, evil came to Willard in a way that would scar the community for generations. 16-year-old Kathy Morrison was everything a teenage girl in 1979 America aspired to be. She had Farrah Fawcett hair that she spent an hour feathering every morning, a collection of tube tops and bell-bottom jeans that made her friends jealous, and a smile that could light up a room even on the grayest Missouri day. She was a cheerleader at Willard High School, though not the head cheerleader, because Kathy was never one to push herself forward or demand attention. She was content being part of the squad, showing up to every practice, perfecting her cartwheels, and cheering her heart out for a football team that rarely won but always tried. Her bedroom walls were plastered with posters of Sean Cassidy and the Bee Gees, and her diary, which she kept faithfully under her mattress, was filled with the typical concerns of a 16-year-old girl. Boys she liked who didn't know she existed. Arguments with her younger sister over borrowed clothes. Dreams about graduating high school and maybe becoming a veterinarian because she loved animals more than anything except maybe her family. Kathy lived with her parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, and her 2 younger siblings in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from the high school. Robert worked at the local feed and grain store, a job he'd held for 20 years, and Linda was a secretary at the elementary school, which meant she knew every family in town and every bit of gossip that circulated. They were solid, dependable people who attended the First Baptist Church every Sunday without fail and believed in hard work, honesty, and taking care of your own. They'd raised their children with those same values, and Kathy embodied them completely. She babysat for neighbors to earn spending money. She helped her mother with canning vegetables from their garden every fall. She called her grandmother every Sunday evening to check in, even though it meant tying up the family's one telephone line for 30 minutes while her siblings complained. The last normal day of Kathy Morrison's life was August 14th, 1979. It was a Tuesday, hot and humid the way Missouri summers always are. The air so thick you could almost drink it. Kathy had spent the morning at cheerleading practice in the high school gym, working on routines for the upcoming football season that would start in 2 weeks. Her best friend, Julie Brennan, would later tell investigators that Kathy had been in a particularly good mood that day, laughing and joking, talking about a boy named Tommy Fletcher who'd asked her to the first game of the season. Not as a date exactly, just to sit together in the bleachers afterward, but it was close enough to make Kathy's heart race with possibility. After practice, around noon, Kathy and Julie had walked to the Dairy Queen on Main Street, ordered cherry-dipped cones, and sat on the curb in the shade talking about everything and nothing the way teenage girls do. Julie had to leave by 1 o'clock to help her father at his hardware store, and she'd hugged Kathy goodbye, told her she'd called that evening and walked away. It was the last time anyone who loved Kathy would see her alive. Kathy had plans to babysit that afternoon for the Henderson family, who lived on the outskirts of town in a farmhouse surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon. Sarah and Mark Henderson had 3 young children under the age of 6, and they'd hired Kathy regularly throughout the summer, while Sarah worked part-time at the library in Springfield. Kathy was supposed to arrive at 2:30, and she was never late. She was responsible that way, the kind of girl who set 2 alarm clocks and always showed up 15 minutes early. So when 2:30 came and went with no Kathy, Sarah Henderson called the Morrison house. Linda Morrison answered surprised, because Kathy had left right after lunch, saying she was going to walk over to the Henderson place. It was only about 1.5 miles, a route Kathy had walked dozens of times, mostly along quiet country roads where the only traffic was the occasional tractor or pickup truck. By 3 o'clock, both families were worried. By 4 o'clock, Robert Morrison had driven the route between their house and the Henderson farm 3 times, his eyes scanning the ditches and fields, his heart starting to hammer with a dread he couldn't yet name. By 5 o'clock, the Willard Police Department had been called, and Chief Roy Patterson, a man who'd been chief for 15 years and had never dealt with anything more serious than bar fights and cattle theft, was organizing a search. By 6 o'clock, 30 volunteers were combing the area, calling Kathy's name, checking abandoned buildings and stands of trees. By sunset, when the sky turned that particular shade of orange and pink that Missouri summers do so well, everyone in Willard knew that Kathy Morrison was missing and that something terrible had happened. The discovery came just after dawn the next morning, August the 15th, in a wooded area about half a mile off the main road between town and the Henderson farm. A volunteer searcher, a local farmer named Bill Yates, had decided to check an overgrown trail that led to an old abandoned barn where teenagers sometimes went to drink beer and smoke cigarettes away from adult eyes. He almost missed her. The underbrush was thick, the early morning light still dim beneath the canopy of oak and maple trees. But something caught his eye, a flash of color that didn't belong. He pushed through the vegetation and then stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Kathy Morrison lay on her back in a small clearing, her Farrah Fawcett hair matted with blood and dirt, her tube top torn, her eyes open and staring at nothing. Bill Yates, a man who'd served in Korea and seen things that gave him nightmares for years, turned away and vomited into the bushes before running back to alert the others. The crime scene told a story that investigators would piece together over the following days and weeks. Kathy had been attacked, violently and brutally, by someone who'd either been waiting for her or had followed her on that quiet country road. There were signs of struggle, broken branches, disturbed earth. Her purse was found 15 feet away, its contents scattered, though her wallet with $12 was still inside. This wasn't a robbery. The medical examiner would later determine that she'd been sexually assaulted and then strangled, her life ending in that isolated patch of woods while the rest of Willard went about their ordinary Tuesday afternoon completely unaware. She'd fought back. There was skin under her fingernails where she'd clawed at her attacker. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Kathy Morrison had not gone quietly into the dark, and that detail would become crucial 45 years later. The town of Willard effectively shut down the day they found Kathy's body. Businesses closed. School was canceled even though it was still summer break and classes hadn't started yet. The First Baptist Church opened its doors for anyone who needed a place to sit and pray or cry or simply be with others who understood the magnitude of what had been lost. The Morrisons' house became a place of pilgrimage, neighbors arriving with casseroles and pies and hugs, though no amount of food or sympathy could fill the crater that had opened in the center of that family. Linda Morrison collapsed when they told her, literally crumpled to the floor, and Robert had to be sedated by the family doctor. Kathy's youngest sister, 12-year-old Beth, locked herself in her room and wouldn't come out for 3 days. Their younger brother, 10-year-old Danny, kept asking when Kathy was coming home, unable to fully grasp that she never would. Chief Patterson, a man more accustomed to mediating neighborly disputes than hunting murderers, called in the Missouri State Highway Patrol and requested help from experienced homicide detectives. By the afternoon of August 15th, the crime scene was swarming with investigators, evidence technicians, and forensic specialists. They collected everything: fiber samples, hair samples, soil samples. The skin cells from under Kathy's fingernails were carefully preserved, though in 1979, DNA analysis was still years away from being a practical investigative tool. They took photographs from every angle. They measured distances and made diagrams. They interviewed everyone who'd been in the area that day, creating a timeline of vehicles and people seen along that stretch of road. And then they began the painful process of trying to figure out who could have done this to a 16-year-old girl who'd never hurt anyone in her entire life. The funeral was held on August 18th at the First Baptist Church, and over 500 people attended, more than half the town's population. The church couldn't hold everyone, so speakers were set up outside for those who had to stand in the parking lot under a brutal August sun. Kathy's cheerleading squad attended in their uniforms, tears streaming down young faces that should have been smiling at football games instead of burying their friend. Her casket was closed, which everyone understood even if no one said it out loud. Robert Morrison gave a eulogy that broke hearts, talking about his little girl who'd wanted to be a veterinarian, who'd loved animals and people with equal intensity, who'd had her whole life ahead of her until someone stole it. Tommy Fletcher, the boy who'd asked Kathy to sit with him at the football game, sat in a back pew and sobbed into his hands, guilt and grief mixing in a way he'd never fully overcome. And somewhere in that crowd, investigators strongly suspected, sat Kathy's killer. Someone who'd known her, who'd lived in this community, who'd watched her grow up, and who'd decided on that August afternoon to take everything from her. Someone who now sat among the mourners, perhaps shedding tears of their own, hiding behind a mask of shared grief while carrying the terrible knowledge of what they'd done. The question was simple and horrifying: who? The investigation into Kathy Morrison's murder began with the kind of intensity that only comes when a small town loses one of its own to violence. Chief Roy Patterson, working alongside Detective Frank Holloway from the Missouri State Highway Patrol, set up a command center in the Willard High School cafeteria, covering the walls with maps, photographs, and timelines. Every piece of evidence collected from that wooded clearing was cataloged and analyzed using the best technology 1979 had to offer, which meant microscopes, fingerprint powder, and blood type analysis. DNA profiling wouldn't become available for criminal cases for another 8 years, so the skin cells Kathy had fought to collect under her fingernails sat preserved in an evidence bag, waiting for a future that didn't yet exist. The investigators started with the people closest to Kathy, because statistics and experience taught them that victims usually know their killers. Tommy Fletcher, the boy who'd asked her to the football game, was interviewed 3 times. He'd been at home that afternoon, he said, helping his father repair a fence on their property. His father confirmed the alibi, but Detective Holloway pressed anyway, looking for inconsistencies, for nervousness that went beyond normal teenage anxiety around police. Tommy broke down during the second interview, not from guilt but from grief, sobbing that he'd liked Kathy since freshman year and had finally worked up the courage to talk to her, only to lose her before anything could begin. His alibi held. He hadn't done this. They looked at Mark Henderson, the father of the children Kathy was supposed to babysit. He'd been home that afternoon, waiting for Kathy to arrive, growing increasingly worried when she didn't show up. His wife Sarah had been at work at the Springfield Library, and phone records confirmed she'd called the Morrison house at 2:45 looking for Kathy. Mark had no criminal record, was a respected member of the community, and had no apparent motive. But Detective Holloway had seen enough cases to know that appearances could deceive, so they checked anyway. Mark's timeline held up. He'd made several phone calls from his house that afternoon, all documented by the phone company. He'd been exactly where he said he was. The investigation expanded to include anyone who'd been seen on or near that stretch of road between town and the Henderson farm on August 14th. Farmers working their fields, delivery drivers making runs, a utility worker checking power lines. Each person was interviewed, their whereabouts verified, their backgrounds checked. 3 men stood out initially as concerning. A drifter who'd been seen at the truck stop outside Willard that morning asking for work. A recently paroled sex offender who'd moved in with his sister 2 towns over just 6 weeks earlier. And a substitute teacher at the high school named Dale Winters, who'd been known to make inappropriate comments about female students. The drifter was tracked down in Arkansas 2 weeks later and had an airtight alibi, having been in jail in Little Rock on an outstanding warrant the day Kathy died. The sex offender's parole officer confirmed he'd been at a mandatory check-in meeting in Springfield that afternoon, verified by signed documents and witnesses. Dale Winters became the focus of intense scrutiny for almost 3 months. Winters was 32, single, lived alone in an apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. He'd been teaching in the area for 2 years, moving from school to school on short-term substitute assignments. Several teachers at Willard High reported feeling uncomfortable around him, though they couldn't articulate exactly why. He stared too long. He stood too close. He made comments about how certain girls were developing, how they dressed, observations that made colleagues cringe. When female students complained about him, which 3 had done over the previous year, the complaints were vague enough that nothing official happened. Just whispered warnings among girls to avoid being alone with Mr. Winters. Detective Holloway got a warrant to search Winters' apartment and found a collection of pornographic magazines and a journal with unsettling entries about his attraction to teenage girls. Disturbing, yes. Illegal, no. And more importantly, Winters had been in Springfield the afternoon of August 14th, attending a training seminar for substitute teachers that didn't end until 4:30. 23 people could confirm he'd been there all afternoon. He couldn't have killed Kathy Morrison. But his proximity to the case and his history got him fired anyway, and he left Missouri within a month. As summer turned to fall and the leaves began changing colors across the Missouri hills, the investigation started running out of leads. Every tip called in to the police hotline was followed up on, every strange car seen in the area was tracked down, every rumor and piece of gossip was investigated. They looked at ex-boyfriends Kathy didn't have because she'd never really dated anyone seriously. They looked at jealous girls from school who might have had some petty grudge, though the idea that a teenage girl could have committed such brutal violence seemed unlikely. They re-interviewed everyone who'd been at cheerleading practice that morning, everyone who'd seen Kathy at Dairy Queen, everyone who lived along that country road. The answer had to be there somewhere, hiding in plain sight, but no matter how hard they looked, they couldn't see it. The case went cold, not with a dramatic moment, but with a slow, painful fading. By Christmas of 1979, Detective Holloway had returned to his regular duties with the Highway Patrol, still haunted by the case, but out of leads to follow. Chief Patterson kept the file on his desk for another year, reading through it late at night, convinced he was missing something obvious. But eventually, even his attention had to shift to other matters, other crimes, the daily responsibilities of keeping a small town safe. The evidence boxes were sealed and stored in the basement of the police station, joining the small collection of other unsolved cases that every department accumulates over the years. The Kathy Morrison murder became the thing everyone in Willard knew about but didn't talk about anymore. A wound that had scarred over but never truly healed. Linda Morrison never recovered from losing her daughter. She continued working at the elementary school for another 5 years, but colleagues said she was never the same, that something essential had broken inside her. She stopped going to church. She stopped attending social functions. She'd be found sometimes standing in Kathy's bedroom, which she'd kept exactly as it was the day Kathy left for the last time, running her hands over the Shawn Cassidy posters and crying silently. In 1984, Linda suffered a massive stroke at age 48. She survived but was left partially paralyzed, requiring full-time care. Robert Morrison quit his job at the feed and grain store to take care of her, and the 2 of them became virtual shut-ins, rarely leaving their house on Elm Street. Their other children, Beth and Danny, grew up faster than they should have, carrying the weight of their sister's murder and their parents' grief. Robert Morrison became obsessed with the case in the way only a parent who's lost a child can. He created his own investigation board in the basement, copies of police reports and newspaper articles covering the walls. Every few months, He'd call Chief Patterson or whoever had taken over the case, asking if there were any updates, any new leads, anything at all. The answer was always the same. "No, Mr. Morrison, we haven't forgotten. We're still working on it, but we don't have anything new." Robert would hang up and return to his basement, staring at his daughter's smiling face in photographs, wondering who had stolen her future and why they were allowed to go on living while Kathy lay in the Willard Cemetery under a headstone that read, "Beloved daughter, taken too soon." The 1980s brought advances in forensic science that gave cold cases new life. DNA profiling became available in 1986, and suddenly skin cells and blood samples that had been useless before became potential gold mines of information. In 1989, 10 years after Kathy's murder, a new detective named Raymond Clark was assigned to the Willard Police Department. Fresh out of the academy and eager to make his mark, Clark requested permission to re-examine the Morrison case using new DNA technology. The skin cells from under Kathy's fingernails were sent to a lab, and for the first time, investigators had a DNA profile of her killer. It was male, definitively not anyone they'd already tested, and it was now sitting in evidence waiting to be matched to a suspect. The problem was they had no suspect to test it against. Clark ran the profile through every database available. Nothing. He requested DNA samples from the few persons of interest who'd never been fully eliminated. Dale Winters, the creepy substitute teacher, refused to provide a sample voluntarily, but a judge ordered it anyway. Not a match. Every lead, every hope, led nowhere. The years crawled by with agonizing slowness for the Morrison family and for Detective Raymond Clark, who'd made solving Kathy's murder his personal mission. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Clark would periodically pull the evidence boxes from storage, spread the contents across his desk, and stare at the case file as if the answer might suddenly reveal itself through sheer force of will. He attended conferences on cold case investigation. He learned about advances in DNA technology. In 2005, when CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, became fully operational nationwide, Clark was one of the first to upload Kathy's killer's DNA profile. He waited for the notification that never came. No match. Whoever had murdered Kathy Morrison in that isolated patch of woods had never been arrested for any crime serious enough to require DNA collection. They were a ghost, invisible in every database, living somewhere out there with their terrible secret. Robert Morrison died in 2008 at age 73, his heart giving out after nearly 3 decades of carrying grief too heavy for any person to bear. Linda had passed 2 years earlier, never having regained full function after her stroke. Their funerals were quiet affairs, attended mostly by family and a dwindling number of people who still remembered Kathy. Beth Morrison, now Beth Caldwell, married with 3 children of her own, stood at her father's grave and felt a complicated mix of relief and guilt. Relief that her parents were finally at peace, no longer tormented by unanswered questions. Guilt that she'd sometimes wished they could just let it go, just accept that they might never know, so the family could move forward. Danny Morrison, who'd become a high school teacher in Springfield, delivered the eulogy and made a promise to his father's casket. He would never stop asking questions, never stop pushing for justice. His sister deserved that much. Detective Clark retired in 2015 after 30 years with the Willard Police Department. On his last day, he met with his replacement, a young detective named Sarah Chen who'd grown up in Springfield and had heard whispers about the Morrison case her entire life. Clark handed her the file boxes personally, looking her in the eyes with an intensity that made her understand this wasn't just another cold case. This was the case, the one that had haunted him for a quarter century, the one that represented every failure, every sleepless night, every time he'd had to call Danny Morrison and say there was still nothing new. Chen promised she'd keep trying, knowing even as she said it how many detectives before her had made the same promise. But Sarah Chen had something her predecessors didn't have. She had forensic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that had exploded into public consciousness in 2018 when investigators used it to catch the Golden State Killer, a monster who'd raped and murdered his way across California in the 1970s and 80s. The technique was almost science fiction in its simplicity. Take a DNA profile from a crime scene, upload it to public genealogy databases where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their DNA, hoping to find long-lost relatives, find distant cousins who shared DNA with your unknown suspect. Build family trees backward through generations until you identify possible candidates. Then verify through traditional detective work. It had solved the seemingly unsolvable, and Chen immediately saw its potential for Kathy's case. In January 2022, Chen reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, the same company that had helped crack dozens of cold cases using forensic genealogy. She submitted Kathy Morrison's case, along with the DNA profile they'd preserved for over 40 years. The cost was steep, nearly $20,000 that the small Willard Police Department didn't have in their budget. Danny Morrison, who'd been waiting his entire adult life for this moment, paid for it himself. His sister's life was worth any amount of money. Dr. Margaret Vance, a genetic genealogist with Parabon, took on the case personally. She uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, two public databases that allowed law enforcement uploads, and waited for the algorithms to find connections. The first hit came in March 2022, a third cousin match, someone who shared a set of great-great-grandparents with Kathy's killer. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. Dr. Vance began the painstaking process of building family trees, working backward through birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, and immigration records. She constructed sprawling genealogical charts that looked like spiderwebs, tracking families as they moved across America, as they married and had children and died. Some branches led nowhere. Some led to people who died before 1979. Some led to women who couldn't have been the source of male DNA. But slowly, methodically, Dr. Vance narrowed the possibilities. By June 2022, she'd identified a family cluster that seemed promising. A family with deep roots in Greene County, Missouri. A family that had lived in and around Willard for generations. Detective Chen worked parallel to Dr. Vance, pulling records on every male in the identified family lines who would have been of viable age in 1979. She looked at addresses, employment records, vehicle registrations, anything that might place someone in the right location at the right time. She found 12 possible candidates, 12 men who fit the age range, who'd lived in the area, who could theoretically have been on that country road the afternoon Kathy Morrison walked to her babysitting job. Chen began the quiet work of elimination, requesting old records, verifying alibis from 4 decades ago, looking for connections to Kathy or her family. 8 of the 12 had died in the years since 1979. Of the 4 remaining, 2 had moved out of state in the 1970s. That left 2 names, 2 possibilities, and one of them made Chen's blood run cold. James Michael Pritchard had been 53 years old in 1979, a well-respected member of the Willard community who owned a successful plumbing business. He'd been married with 3 children, active in the Rotary Club, a deacon at First Baptist Church. He'd been one of the volunteers who'd searched for Kathy Morrison when she went missing. He'd attended her funeral. He'd hugged Robert and Linda Morrison and told them how sorry he was, how Kathy had been such a sweet girl, how the whole town was devastated. And according to the family tree Dr. Vance had constructed, he was the most likely source of the DNA found under Kathy's fingernails. Chen felt sick as she pulled up current information on Pritchard. He was 97 years old now, living in an assisted living facility in Springfield. He'd sold his business in 1995 and retired to a comfortable life funded by decades of hard work. His wife had died in 2010. His 3 children, now in their 60s and 70s, were all successful, respected members of the community, and none of them had any idea what their father had done. But Chen was a detective, and detectives don't make arrests based on genealogy alone, no matter how compelling. She needed confirmation. She needed James Pritchard's actual DNA to compare to the sample from 1979. The problem was getting it without alerting him. If he'd kept his secret for 43 years, he'd be careful. Chen assigned a surveillance team to watch Pritchard at his assisted living facility, waiting for an opportunity. They watched him for 2 weeks, documenting his routine, morning coffee in the common area, afternoon walks in the garden with his walker, dinner in the dining hall, Bible study on Wednesday evenings. He seemed like what he appeared to be, a frail, elderly man living out his final years in peace. On April 12, 2022, they got what they needed. Pritchard had lunch in the facility's dining room and used the paper napkin that he crumpled and left on his tray. After he'd gone, an undercover officer posing as a visitor retrieved the napkin from the trash. It was rushed to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab with a priority flag. The wait for results was excruciating. Chen barely slept, running scenarios in her mind. What if it wasn't a match? What if they'd gotten it wrong? What if she had to call Danny Morrison and tell him they'd gotten his hopes up for nothing? But on April 19th, 2022, the call came. The lab technician's voice was steady, but Chen could hear the excitement underneath. It was a match. The DNA on the napkin matched the DNA from under Kathy Morrison's fingernails with a probability of 99.9%. After 43 years, they had their killer. James Michael Pritchard, killer of the community, church deacon, grandfather of 7, had murdered a 16-year-old girl and hidden it for more than 4 decades. Chen sat alone in her office after the call ended, staring at a photograph of Kathy Morrison from the case file. That bright smile, that feathered hair, that whole life ahead of her that Pritchard had stolen. She thought about Robert and Linda Morrison, who died without knowing justice would eventually come. She thought about Detective Clark, retired now but still checking in every few months to ask if there was any progress. She thought about the people who'd searched those woods in August 1979, including Pritchard himself, knowing what he'd done, seeing the devastation he'd caused, and saying nothing. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. The arrest warrant was issued on April 22, 2022, but Chen made a decision. Before they arrested Pritchard, she needed to tell the family. Danny Morrison deserved to hear it from her, not from news reports or gossip. She drove to his house in Springfield on a Saturday morning and sat with him and his sister Beth in their living room. When she told them they'd identified their sister's killer using forensic genealogy, both siblings began crying before she even said the name. When she revealed it was James Pritchard, someone they'd known their entire lives, someone who'd been at their father's funeral, Beth actually gasped out loud. Danny put his head in his hands and sobbed. Not tears of joy, because there's no joy in learning your sister's murderer had been hiding in plain sight for your entire life, but tears of relief that finally, they knew the truth. The actual arrest happened 3 days later on April 25, 2022. Chen wanted to do it quietly, respectfully, because despite what Pritchard had done, he was 97 years old and frail. But protocol required multiple officers, and news of the arrest warrant had leaked. By the time they arrived at the assisted living facility, 3 news crews were already setting up in the parking lot. Chen and her partner entered Pritchard's room to find him sitting in a recliner, watching the morning news. He looked up when they entered, and Chen saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise, recognition. He'd been waiting for this moment for 43 years, and now that it arrived, he seemed almost relieved. When Chen read him his rights and told him he was under arrest for the murder of Kathy Morrison, Pritchard nodded slowly. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't deny anything. He simply asked if he could put on his shoes. At the police station, in an interrogation room that felt surreal given Pritchard's age and frailty, Chen and her partner sat across from a man who'd carried a terrible secret for nearly half a century. And James Pritchard, perhaps exhausted from decades of pretending, perhaps believing his advanced age might earn him some mercy, confessed. He told them how he'd seen Kathy walking that August afternoon while he was driving home from a plumbing job, how he'd always thought she was beautiful, had watched her grow up, had felt things he knew were wrong, how he'd pulled over and offered her a ride, and she'd accepted because she knew him, trusted him. How he'd driven her not toward the Henderson farm, but to that isolated wooded area, telling her he needed to check on some pipes for a job. How he'd made advances that she'd rejected with horror and disgust. How when she tried to run, he'd grabbed her. How she'd fought and scratched and screamed. And how he'd strangled her to silence her and then left her body in that clearing before driving away like nothing had happened. The trial of James Michael Pritchard began in November 2023, and every seat in the Greene County Courthouse was filled. Pritchard's children sat in shock, their father's reputation and their own memories of their childhood completely shattered. Danny and Beth Morrison sat in the front row, flanked by cousins and friends, finally witnessing the justice their parents had died waiting for. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the forensic genealogy process, and the recorded confession. Dr. Vance testified about the science that had led them to Pritchard. Detective Chen described the investigation. The defense, a court-appointed attorney who'd drawn an impossible case, could only argue that Pritchard's age and frailty warranted compassion. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty of second-degree murder. Pritchard showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his face a mask of exhaustion and resignation. Sentencing came in January 2024. The judge, a woman named Patricia Foster, who'd grown up hearing about the Morrison case, had no mercy in her voice. She sentenced James Pritchard to life in prison without possibility of parole, knowing full well that at 98 years old, he'd likely die behind bars within months or years. Pritchard was remanded to custody immediately, and the news footage of him being led away in handcuffs, frail and shuffling, shocked the community that had known him as a respected businessman and church leader. Where are you watching this from today? Drop a comment and let us know. The arrest in March 2024 that opened this story was actually Pritchard being transferred to a medical facility. But the shock to the Springfield community was real and profound. People who'd known James Pritchard for decades couldn't reconcile the kind neighbor and church deacon with the monster who'd murdered a teenage girl. His children released a statement expressing their horror and extending their deepest apologies to the Morrison family, though they knew no apology could ever be adequate. Danny Morrison visited his parents' graves the day after Pritchard's sentencing. He stood between their headstones in the cold January wind and told them what had happened, told them that Kathy's killer had finally been caught, that justice had finally come, even if it took 45 years. He brought flowers for Kathy's grave too, the same plot where he and Beth had stood countless times throughout their lives. The headstone still read, "Beloved daughter, taken too soon." But now there was closure to go with the grief. Detective Sarah Chen kept a copy of Kathy Morrison's photograph on her desk, right next to her computer monitor. Not the school picture that had been in all the news reports, but a candid shot of Kathy at a cheerleading practice, mid-laugh, her whole face lit up with the kind of joy that only 16-year-olds who haven't yet learned how cruel the world can be possess. Chen looked at that photo every day and thought about the victims still waiting for justice, still waiting for science to catch up with the people who'd stolen their futures. She thought about the fact that Kathy's own DNA evidence, the skin cells she'd fought to collect under her fingernails in her final moments of terror, had reached across 45 years to identify her killer. Even in death, Kathy Morrison had fought back. James Pritchard died in prison 7 months after his sentencing, in August 2024. He was 98 years old. There was no funeral, no obituary beyond a brief notice. His children quietly had him cremated and scattered his ashes without ceremony. The plumbing business that had once borne his name had been sold decades earlier, but the new owners immediately rebranded to distance themselves from the association. In Willard, Missouri, people stopped talking about James Pritchard as someone they'd known and started talking about him as the monster who'd been hiding among them all along. Churches updated their background check policies. Parents had new conversations with their children about trust and safety. The illusion of small-town innocence, already shattered in 1979, was broken again in a different way. But Kathy Morrison's story didn't end with her killer's death. The Clara Hoffman Memorial Foundation, inspired by another case solved through forensic genealogy, partnered with Danny Morrison to establish a scholarship in Kathy's name for students pursuing careers in veterinary medicine, the dream she'd never gotten to fulfill. Every year, a graduating senior from Willard High School receives funding to chase the dream that Kathy couldn't. Her cheerleading squad created a memorial trophy given annually to the athlete who best embodies sportsmanship and kindness. Small gestures, perhaps, but ways of ensuring that Kathy Morrison is remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. The case file, once stored in dusty evidence boxes in a basement, now sits in a climate-controlled archive, available for law enforcement training and for other investigators working cold cases. The techniques used to solve Kathy's murder have been replicated hundreds of times now, giving closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. Detective Clark, now 83 and in declining health, got the call from Chen the day Pritchard was arrested. He cried on the phone, not ashamed of his tears, thanking her for finishing what he couldn't. He died 6 months later, and his family said his last words were about finally getting justice for Kathy Morrison. On August 14th each year, the anniversary of Kathy's death, a small group still gathers at her grave in Willard Cemetery. Danny and Beth, now in their 50s and 60s with grandchildren of their own. A few former classmates who never forgot their friend with the Farrah Fawcett hair and the brilliant smile. Detective Chen, who feels a connection to a girl she never met but fought for anyway. They bring flowers, usually sunflowers because those were Kathy's favorites. They tell stories about her, keeping her memory alive, not as a victim, but as a person who loved animals, who worked hard, who was kind to everyone, who had dreams and plans and a future that should have been extraordinary. Evil can hide behind the most familiar faces, can sit beside you in church, can help search for the victims it creates, can live decades without consequence. But time and science and determination can strip away those masks eventually. Kathy Morrison waited 45 years for justice, preserved in evidence and in the memories of people who refused to forget her. And in the end, through DNA she didn't even know she was collecting, through technologies that didn't exist when she died, through investigators who inherited a promise made before they were born, justice came. It came late. It came after the people who loved her most had died waiting for it. But it came. And somewhere in the mystery of whatever comes after life, perhaps a 16-year-old girl with feathered hair and dreams of becoming a veterinarian finally knows that her killer didn't get away with it after all, that she mattered, that she was remembered, that she was loved, and that even 45 years later, even from beyond the grave, she helped ensure that James Michael Pritchard would finally face the consequences of what he'd done on that August afternoon when he stole everything from a girl who trusted him.